Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tiffany Garcia, and I'm a librarian at the San Jose Public Library. Today, we have Gordon Smith from the Japanese American Museum of San Jose, and he will be giving this presentation on Japanese American history, especially focusing around Japantown and San Jose and immigration as it came about in history. All right, and now I'll go ahead and pass the spotlight to Gordon.
Thank you, Tiffany, for that introduction. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking part of your day to listen to my presentation. I do enjoy giving these. I am the Vice President and Head Docent of the Japanese American Museum of San Jose, and hopefully some of you have been able to visit our museum before the COVID pandemic. Our mission statement is there in the bottom. And though we're located in San Jose, we don't limit our collections just to the San Jose area. We collect Japanese American history, culture, and arts from throughout the greater San Francisco Bay Area. So here's my outline for my presentation. And so the ones in red, the top three, I'm going to cover those together first, and then we'll move on later on to the others on the list. So why did the Japanese emigrate? Well, actually, before I answer that question, I need to tell you a little bit about some legislation that was passed by our Congress way back in 1790, 95, and 98, because it does have some importance to the story of the immigration of Japanese Americans. Those years, there were acts that were passed. They were called the Naturalization Acts. And what they said was that naturalization, that is, for an immigrant to become a U.S. citizen, they had to be free white persons. What that meant in reality was that immigrants from Asia could never become U.S. citizens. So now we're going to jump ahead to 1853. And for about 200 years prior to 1853, the government of Japan had prohibited almost all foreigners from visiting Japan, and almost all Japanese could not leave Japan and go back to Japan. This was because the shoguns who ruled Japan felt that these foreigners were dangerous influences. However, by the 1850s, there was trade being made between Europe and Asia, and the United States Congress wanted to get in on this trade. They thought there'd be profit to be made, and they also wanted to get a coaling port for the coal that was used to power the steamships. So in 1853, the Navy sent a Navy commander, Commodore Perry, with a fleet of warships to visit Japan. These were gunboats. And what he did was literally at the point of a spear, he forced the Japanese government to sign treaties that opened trade to Japan, and also for the first time in over 200 years, allowed the Japanese to emigrate, that is, to leave Japan and go to other countries. So one of the popular places for them to go was to Hawaii and the United States. And why did they go? Basically, they went because at this time, Japan was in some very dire economic straits. There were very many poor rural families, especially in southern Japan. And in the Japanese culture, the family farm went to the oldest son. And that had to be the case because the farms were already so small that they couldn't be divided any further and support a family. So the younger sons had to find their own way in life, and they were looking for work. So who were these very earliest arrivals? Well, in Hawaii, there was a group that was called the Ganen Mono that went in 1868, about 150 people. They went to work on the sugarcane and pineapple plantations, but they were treated so badly that the Japanese government prohibited any further emigration to Hawaii, and that prohibition stayed in place until 1885. But those that went to the West Coast, there was another group Were also about 150 people. They settled in a place called Coloma here in Northern California, and they set up the Wakamatsu Tea and Silk Farm Colony. Now, the colony only lasted about 2 years before it disbanded. However, today it is a historical site, and if you look at this picture on the right, you'll see the front entrance to the site, as well as the plaque and memorial to that first group. To a number of Japanese Americans, this is their Plymouth Rock. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the later immigration to the West Coast and Hawaii. And I do talk about them separately because at this time period, Hawaii was still an independent country. It was the monarchy of Hawaii. It was not yet a part of the United States. So this story is actually a story primarily of two independent immigration events that occurred. So, talking about the West Coast. Well, first, it was clearly not affected by that Hawaii immigration ban. So, immigration continued unabated from 1868. And they, of course, went to the three large cities on the West Coast. So, they settled in Seattle, Los Angeles, and of course, here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, the Chinese were actually the first large group of Asian immigrants to come to our country. They had made a lot of important contributions, not the least of which they were 80% of the workforce of the company that built that portion of the Transcontinental Railroad that went from Sacramento into Utah. This company had the tough job of building a railroad through the Sierra Nevada mountains, something that a lot of people said simply could not be done. The other company that built the Transcontinental Railroad had the easy job. They started in St. Louis, Missouri, and they built across the flat plains of the Midwest. Well, those Chinese workers, they accomplished what many people said was impossible, and they did build that part of the Transcontinental Railroad through those mountains. But unfortunately, a lot of hatred, prejudice, animosity developed against these Chinese immigrants. And in response, in 1882, our Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited any further immigration of Chinese to the United States. What this meant then was larger numbers of Japanese started coming to the United States since there was still a demand for their cheap labor. And then after 1898, the numbers increased again, because 1898 was the year that the United States annexed Hawaii, that is, made Hawaii a territory of the United States. So movement from Hawaii to the West Coast was no longer considered immigration. It was kind of like moving from California to Idaho or to Utah. It was movement within the United States. Now, they formed a lot of Japantowns. Most of them were on the West Coast, but there was actually one that was built as far east as Massachusetts. And there were also some events that occurred in 1907 on the West Coast that was important to this story. However, I'm going to talk about that in some later slides. A couple of pictures. This is Ellis Island. This is well known. This was the gateway for immigrants from Europe. A little less well known, but this is Angel Island, which was the gateway for immigrants from Asia. So now we're going to move on to Hawaii. So immigration could again occur from 1885 to Hawaii as an independent country until 1898. So the plantation owners in Hawaii wanted cheap labor. They sent recruiters to Hawaii to recruit what were known as indentured servants, indentured laborers. This was a system by which if you wanted to come to the United States, but you could not afford the ship fare, you signed a contract with a company or maybe an individual that in exchange for ship fare, you would work for them for 3, 5, maybe 7 years for little or sometimes no pay. The young men looking for work, they weren't very sophisticated. They believed the tales that Hawaii was going to be a great place, the work would be good, good company housing, they were going to have a good life in Hawaii. When they actually got to Hawaii, they found out that things were very different. There were very long days of hard labor. They lived in dilapidated company housing, had to buy things in company stores with inflated prices. Some of them had lives little better than slaves. Indeed, physical punishments could be meted out. Men could be whipped for resting or smoking or talking on the job. Things were so bad that many returned to Japan or they fled to the West Coast. And that was beneficial because during the Civil War, our country passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which outlawed involuntary servitude. And this indentured labor system was considered to be involuntary servitude, so indentured labor contracts were unconstitutional in the United States. Just a few pictures of what it was like in Hawaii, picking pineapples, almost like spears of the leaves for the pineapple plants. The sugarcane plantations were so large, the owners built railroads to transport the sugarcane to the sugarcane mills. This bottom photo shows a group of those immigrants. And in the lower left picture, you'll see two women. Women also worked in the fields. And you'll notice they're dressed from head to toe in this heavy clothing in this very warm, very humid climate. And that's because sugarcane has very long, very sharp leaves. You had to wear the heavy clothing to protect yourself from being cut by the sugarcane leaves. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the events that took place in California. So, California, let's see, what happened? Well, the number of Japanese immigrants was increasing to California. And indeed, there was an anti-Japanese movement that resulted because of that. And this was true even though the Japanese immigrants represented only a small percentage of the population of California. And this movement became known as the Yellow Peril. In other words, there was fear that these Japanese immigrants would overwhelm the West Coast of the United States and take over the area. This was showed up in things like there were resolutions adopted by the California legislature to deny birthright citizenship to children of Japanese Americans. Similar legislation was passed by the state of Oregon. And the numbers grew larger, and this yellow peril fear grew to the point that there was something called the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907 that took place. So this was an agreement between the governments of the United States and Japan, which halted the immigration of Japanese male laborers. They were the majority of the immigrants. People like teachers or scientists could still come. However, importantly, this agreement still allowed that the men that were living here in the United States, the Japanese men, that if they had wives and children in Japan, they could still come to the United States, they could still immigrate here. And even more importantly, allowed that for the single Japanese men living here, that if they found brides in Japan, they could bring their brides to the United States. So some of these single young men, the ones who were better off, they managed to return to Japan and get married and bring their brides back. But most of them were not that well off. So a system developed that was built on the traditional way marriages occurred in Japan. For a very long time, marriages in Japan were arranged by families. Marriage really wasn't considered a romantic affair. This was something that was arranged between families to benefit both families. So these single young Japanese men on the West Coast, what they would do is write a letter about themselves, bragging about how well they're doing, usually exaggerating their accomplishments, and either sending a younger picture of themselves or sometimes even sending a picture of another man who was younger than they were. And so when their families in Japan got this letter and picture, they would show it around the family village. They would try to find a family that had a daughter that they wished to get married. Or they would hire a professional marriage arranger. That was a profession. And then there'd actually be a wedding in Japan. This was a true wedding. It was a ceremony. There was food. The bride was dressed up. And the groom, well, the poor groom, he's stuck here in California. He can't make it back to his own wedding. So maybe his younger brother or a male cousin or a male friend would stand in for him. These were called proxy marriages, and they were legal in Japan. So the bride got a marriage certificate that allowed her to come to the United States. Also, because of this yellow peril concern, in 1913, California passed the Alien Land Law, which said aliens ineligible for citizenship, that meant immigrants from Asia, could no longer buy land in California. That really affected that first generation. This land law proved to be popular among other states, and so it was widely adopted throughout the Western United States. So now we're going to move on. We're going to talk about what happened when Hawaii became part of the United States. So Hawaii. Again, as I mentioned, Hawaii was annexed by the United States in 1898. A group of sugarcane and pineapple plantation owners, they got together, they overthrew the monarchy, they had a short-lived republic, but their real goal was to become part of the United States, which they did. When that happened, that meant the Chinese Exclusion Act applied in Hawaii, so no more immigrants from China to Hawaii, which meant that more Japanese were immigrants to Hawaii. Those indentured labor contracts that these young men had entered into, if they were still under those contracts, they were now free from them. They were voided. They were now unconstitutional. And on May 1st of 1901, birthright citizenship was granted to children born in Hawaii. And as I mentioned before, moving to the West Coast was no longer considered immigration. It was just movement within the United States. So many Japanese left Hawaii and went to the West Coast. And as I mentioned before, that added to the yellow peril movement fears. Indeed, so many Japanese left Hawaii and went to the West Coast that by presidential executive order, that practice was stopped in 1907. That 1907 gentleman's agreement also now applied in Hawaii. So picture brides and proxy marriages were also very common in Hawaii. Indeed, enough Japanese had moved to Hawaii, gotten married, had families, children, that by 1942, 38% of the population of Hawaii were Japanese Americans. So now we're going to start talking about San Jose's Japantown. This will be kind of a whirlwind history. It will be a very brief history, but I'll give you a website later on in the presentation where you can learn some more about the history of our Japantown. So I do want to thank three individuals, three acquaintances of mine, Kurt Fukuda, Connie Young Yu, and Robert Ragsack. They're the actual true historians of Japantown. And I've used the knowledge that they've gained to help me with making this presentation. Indeed, they've been major players in a new project that the Japanese American Museum has undertaken. And it actually created a augmented reality walking tour of Japantown. So as you make this tour on your cell phone, you'll see artwork that's been created associated with Japantown. I don't have time to tell you much more about that, but if you're interested, I direct you to this particular website, Hidden Histories, jtown.org. If you go there, you'll learn all about this exciting new virtual reality project that we've undertaken. Again, I mentioned that the Chinese immigrants were the first Asian immigrants to come. They built 5 Chinatowns in San Jose between 1866 and the 1880s. But again, hatred, violence, prejudice, animosity quickly rose up against these Chinese immigrants. Again, culminated 1882 in the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, downtown San Jose, some of you, hopefully many of you, are familiar with the Fairmont Hotel that's there. I understand the hotel was just recently sold, but I think it's still called the Fairmont Hotel. Now, the site that the hotel is on used to be a Chinatown, but unfortunately, the City Council of San Jose in 1887 declared that Market Street Chinatown to be a public nuisance, to be something that should eventually be removed. Well, that was followed shortly thereafter by the Chinatown being burned down by arsonists. The perpetrators were never caught. I am happy to report that just last month, just this past October, that the City Council of San Jose passed a resolution which apologized for the words and deeds and actions of those previous city councils and people in San Jose that had such hatred for the Chinese. Now, what happened to those roughly 1,300 people who have been in that Market Street Chinatown? I mean, they were now homeless. Many of them lost their livelihoods because their businesses were burned to the ground. Well, fortunately, there was a gentleman, a Mr. John Heinlein. He was a German American. He was an immigrant, but he was brought here when he was 3 years old. But nonetheless, though he was, he went to the Midwest originally as an infant. He moved to California, became a very successful businessman, and he owned several parcels of land in and around San Jose. Now, he was a good friend of the Chinese. He believed the Chinese to be good people. He believed they were family-oriented, they were honest, they were hardworking. Indeed, he hired a number of Chinese immigrants to work for him. So he was very concerned about these people who had been displaced by that arson of the Market Street Chinatown. Now, one of the parcels of land that he owned, located in Japantown. This is an old map of Japantown. But to get you oriented, let me bring you down here first to the lower part, the lower right part of the map. You'll see that's where San Jose State University is. And if you go directly north, you'll go past City Hall and end up here in what is today Japantown. He owned a parcel of land that was near East Taylor Street up here in the end. If I can get my cursor to work there. There we go. East Taylor. And so this plot of land here that was bordered by 6th and 7th Street, he owned that. And he started making plans to lease that land to those displaced Chinese so they could rebuild a Chinatown. Well, when word of that got out to the surrounding community, they were very upset. They were so upset they did things like they held torchlight midnight marches on his house. They made death threats against him. But Mr. Heinlein was a very brave man. He went ahead with his plans. He leased the land to those Chinese businesses. They built a new Chinatown, which became known as Heinleinville. Now, if you'd like to learn some more about the history of Chinese Americans and the Heinleinville, I direct you to another organization that's here locally, here in San Jose. It's the Chinese Historical and Cultural Project. This is their website, chcp.org. They actually have a small museum in History Park, San Jose. It is open every other Sunday, but I'm sorry, I don't remember which Sundays those are, but go to their website and you'll find out. Now, the Japanese immigrants started coming later. They also faced hatred and prejudice, and they found that, conditions were not very welcoming for them. But they found they were welcomed by the Chinese in Heinleinville. They could find a place to live. They could eat in restaurants there, get some entertainment, and do shopping. It was a place of refuge from the prevailing Asian racism. So again, those earliest Japanese, they came looking for farm work, which unfortunately did become more plentiful for them after the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, since no new Chinese immigrants were coming. So Japanese businesses started springing up near the intersection of Jackson and North 5th Street, which was located close to that Heinleinville Chinatown. Owners of land near there started constructing simple wooden buildings, which they could lease to Japanese to be used as residences or businesses. So Japantown was forming. It was starting to become a focal point for Japanese farmers and other Japanese working in the Santa Clara Valley area. Now, there's no exact date for when Japantown was founded, but it's generally agreed that Japantown was founded in 1890. And this is a picture of one of those early general stores, dry goods stores in that Japantown. So I'm going to talk now about the years from 1900 to 1920. These were the growing years for Japantown. And I'm going to go back yet again to this gentleman's agreement of 1907. This was very important to the Japanese immigrants, the single Japanese immigrants living in California. And why was that? Because at that time, California had an anti-miscegenation law. So what are anti-miscegenation laws? Those are laws which used to be prevalent in our country, which made it illegal. It was against the law for people of different races to get married. So these single Japanese men, these immigrants, even if they found a white woman that they fell in love with and that she fell in love with him and they wanted to get married, they could not do so. It was against the law for them to get married. So this gentleman's agreement did allow that these single young Japanese men could go back to Japan or use the picture bride system and bring over wives so they could now start having children and raising families. So Japantown started becoming much more of a family-oriented community rather than what it had been previously, which was a community catering primarily to bachelors. There was a hospital built in Japantown in 1910, the Kuwabara Hospital, and that was so Japanese-speaking patients could have a hospital where they had Japanese-speaking medical staff. Okita Hall was built in 1960. It was to help provide entertainment. It featured live Japanese performances and then Japanese language movies. But when Japanese television came to Northern California, they had to find other uses for the building. Continuing on, there have been 3 Buddhist churches built in San Jose. This was the original one. It was actually kind of a converted house. They were built on 3 different locations. This is a picture of the original Methodist church that was built in San Jose, a pretty modest structure. They stayed at their original location, but they greatly expanded and renovated the church. So today, if you come to San Jose, situated right across the street from our museum, you'll see a very nice, very large Methodist church with a very active congregation. Now we're going to go from 1920 to 1941. And in a few minutes, I'll explain why this ends in 1941. This was considered a golden age for Japantown. It was becoming even more of a family-oriented community. Mostly farmers, but Japanese from all over Santa Clara Valley came. They came to get repairs to their farm equipment or their bicycles. Maybe they needed to see the dentist or the doctor, the shop for groceries, to socialize. And for the kids, the children especially, it was a great chance to play with other children and, of course, go to the candy store and buy candy. That was very popular for those children. This was a parade that was held at the intersection of 5th and Jackson Street. That still remains the heart of Japantown today. And on the right is a picture while the new Buddhist church, this is the 3rd one, the final one, as it's being constructed. It was modeled on a Buddhist temple in Kyoto, Japan. Now we're going to move on. We're going to come to a sad chapter. This is about the internment of the West Coast Japanese after the Pearl Harbor attack. So I'm not going to talk about the attack on Pearl Harbor. That's well known and well covered in other places. But there were 2 fears that developed after the attack on Pearl Harbor. One was that the Japanese military would invade the West Coast. And then the second fear was that the Japanese American community residing in the West Coast, that they would do spying and sabotage to support that invasion. Well, that resulted first in a curfew being placed on Japanese Americans. You had to be home by 8 p.m. You couldn't leave your house until 6 a.m. And you were not to travel any more than 25 miles from your home unless you need to do so for work. But nonetheless, pressure continued to build from politicians, from the military, and members of the public to remove the Japanese to inland camps where they could not support a military invasion. That pressure went up to President Franklin Roosevelt. February the 19th, 1942, he signed Executive Order 9066 that authorized the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. I'm going to cover the internment experience very quickly. If you'd like to learn more, I'll direct you to the National Park Service. Just look for Japanese confinement sites, or another organization. It's called Densho, and that means to transmit to younger generations. This is an organization just online, and it's dedicated to preserving and sharing the history of the Japanese American internment, densho.org. So, following President Roosevelt's executive order, notices like this started being posted throughout the West Coast. These were instructions to people of Japanese ancestry. And the word ancestry was deliberately used because these instructions applied not just to the Issei generation, the first generation, the ones who by law could never become U.S. citizens, but also apply to their children and grandchildren who were U.S. citizens, who were birthright citizens. About 2/3 of the people removed during the internment were U.S. citizens. This is a sad picture. This is a family had a grocery store trying to proclaim their loyalty as Americans, but to no avail. They had to sell their grocery store. These people, they went with dignity despite all the problems they faced. I'm asking you to imagine yourself. I'm going to tell you. In fact, I am telling you. In 1 month's time, you're to show up at a collection point with only what you can hand carry. You have to decide what to do with your cookware, your furniture, your washing machine, your refrigerator, your motor vehicles, your houses, your businesses. You have to decide what you're going to do with them in that 1 month time period that I'm giving you. Most people ended up selling everything for pennies on the dollar. Now, in this picture, you may notice there are tags on the outer clothing of some of them, as well as the same tags on their luggage. Before they were showed up at a collection point, each family was given a set of identically numbered tags, one on their outer clothing and their possessions. From that point forward, they were not known by their family name, they were known by their number. This is a picture of some of them waiting to board a train to go to an internment camp. They're considered so dangerous, there's a line of armed military soldiers to guard them. So Japantown, our San Jose Japantown, was not immune to the internment. Japantown practically became a ghost town during those years. This is a picture of one of the few businesses that remained open in Japantown because it had been leased to a white family. But very fortunately, there was an attorney in San Jose. His name was James Ben Peckham. He was an early civil rights pioneer. He really wanted to protect Japantown. So he pushed the city council of San Jose to organize police patrols of Japantown to keep down the looting and vandalism. He even organized civilian patrols to do the same, to keep out the graffiti and the other damage that could be done to Japantown. He's a real hero to the Japantown community. So now this is a map. This shows a number of the sites where Japanese Americans were confined, some temporarily, some for the full 4 years. But the main camps are these sites, these black triangles that are encircled by these orange ovals. The majority of the 120,000 Japanese Americans removed and held in internment were held at these sites. This is a picture of one of the sites. I'll quickly describe what it was like. People lived in these long horizontal buildings that you see here. They were called barracks. This is a layout of a barrack. If you were lucky, your family got to get one of these rooms for their own. They were euphemistically called apartments. If your family was too small, you were single or a married couple, you had to live with total strangers. There was only electricity to these barracks, no water, no kitchens. That meant all the food was cooked and eaten cafeteria style in the dining hall or mess hall. And showers and the use of toilets took place in these other two buildings here for this group of barracks that was called a block. Laundry facilities were also in this building. The government did build separate facilities for men and women. If you come to our museum, you'll see a reproduction, a replica of one of these barracks rooms at a camp that was called Tule Lake. I'll just point out a few features here. People had to make their own furniture. They would collect scrap lumber from building the barracks. They would hang up clothes sheets from clotheslines, trying to get a little bit of privacy while they were living here in this room. And in the center of this room, you'll notice this, it's a black stove. It was a coal-fired stove. It was the only source of heat. And in some of these camps during the winter, the temperatures got down to minus 20 or minus 25 degrees. I'm going to talk a little bit about the military service of Japanese Americans. I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between Hawaii and the West Coast as far as the internment is concerned. Since almost 40% of the population of Hawaii were Japanese Americans, the government realized they couldn't send all those people to internment camps on the mainland. The economy would collapse. So there were a large number of young Japanese American men who wanted to serve in the military from Hawaii, and they applied enough political pressure that they formed the 100th Battalion of the Hawaii Territorial National Guard. They were first sent to North Africa to fight. They were very successful, so the military decided to create a larger military unit, was called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which fought primarily in the European theater. They fought with great bravery. They knew they were paving the way for the reintegration of Japanese Americans into society. So they became, for a unit of its size and length of service, the most decorated for bravery in the history of the US military. And then there was a much smaller unit called the Military Intelligence Service, which was actually a group of Japanese American soldiers who were proficient in Japanese. So they served in the Pacific Theater as translators, interpreters, and interrogators. Ironically, many of them were people who were called kibe. So as young children, they had been sent to Japan to meet the families, learn the language. And so they came under suspicion because they had been living in Japan, but then they became very valuable as members of the Military Intelligence Service. Now, things did not totally come to a standstill in Japantown. There was actually a new church built in 1943. It was built by an African-American minister, Elder Milton Mathis. And I'm very happy to report that the building has changed, but the Prayer Garden Church still stands in San Jose and still has a large active congregation. This is a picture leaving the internment camps. No military guards now. Now, they were welcomed when they went back to the West Coast. And no, not really. There was still a lot of prejudice, hatred, and animosity against Japanese Americans going back to the West Coast. So from 1945 to 1969, that's considered a period of resettlement and the peak years for Japantown. This is a picture taken in 1952 of a children's parade. By this time, most of the original wooden buildings had been replaced by modern structures. And by this time, most of the Issei, that first generation, had retired. And it was the second generation, or the Nisei, that came into ownership of the businesses in Japantown. This was also the time when Norman Mineta, after whom we've named our international airport and a freeway, that he graduated from San Jose High School. So from 1970 to 1985, this was considered a period of both reawakening and some rejuvenation. Reawakening because by this time, the third generation of Japanese Americans had come into ownership of the businesses, but there were a number of third generation Japanese Americans who started to move away from Japantown. They wanted to move to other Bay Area neighborhoods. The housing in the area had gotten kind of old by now, and they wanted to live in a new development. So Japantown started to awaken to the need to keep Japantown alive. And so that eventually led to a redevelopment effort. It was during this time that some senior apartments were built called Fuji Towers, that Kuwabara Hospital had been built way back in 1910, was rejuvenated and renamed the Issei Memorial Building, and so became an office building. in tribute to that first generation of Japanese Americans. This was also a time there was a Filipino American, Jacinto Tony Sigquig, who pushed successfully over many years to get a new community center built just on the outskirts of Japantown. Now, 1985, continuing on to the present day, these are the redevelopment years. So this continued actually through the 2000s. So some of the things that happened, the fronts, the outside of businesses, a lot of them got renovated. Japantown used to have all overhead line utilities. Most of them got placed underground. So the skyline is a lot more pleasant to look at. This was a time when some plaques started going up in Japantown to talk about the history of Japantown. And indeed, this is a picture here of that intersection, again, of Jackson and Fifth, the heart of Japantown. You don't see them here, but if you go there today, you'll see a plaque on each one of the corners. And if you visit them in turn, you'll get a very short history of San Jose's Japantown. Public art started going up as well. When you come to visit Japantown, you may have noticed, or you will notice, there are some very large murals on the sides of buildings in Japantown. And some of them are pretty impressive. If you haven't seen them, I encourage you to come just to look at those murals. A number of interpretive signs. This is kind of a fancy way of signs put up explaining more about the history of Japantown went up. One of the most interesting is there are a number of low-lying black stone benches throughout Japantown, and most of them are placed in front of buildings with a picture of what the building used to look like and an explanation of the history of that building. My favorite, though, is if you look in this picture where you see the pickup truck, there was a wall built. So the top and the side of the wall facing the store has a timeline of the history of Japantown, but the side facing the street has both in Japanese characters and English some of the common Japanese sayings that people growing up in Japantown learned, even if they didn't actually learn the Japanese language. These were ones they had heard from their parents and grandparents. We now even have a dance studio in Japantown. Remarkable. This was also a time when the predecessor to the Japanese American Museum of San Jose, we were known as the Japanese American Resource Center back then. We had been just one room in that Issei Memorial Building. And thanks to a very generous benefactor, Mr. Eiichi Sakaway, we were able to move into a 4-bedroom house. So a number of years ago, if you came to our museum, we'd give you a tour through a 4-bedroom house. But about 10 years ago, we were fortunate. We had a big fundraising. We got some grants. We were able to tear down the 4-bedroom house and build the current museum. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what ended the internment. In 1990, President George Bush, following the passage of the Civil Liberties Act signed by President Reagan, he signed a letter, and this letter was sent to all former internees as an apology from the U.S. government and the U.S. people for the injustice of the internment. I'm also happy to report many communities have issued their own individual apologies and taken some compensatory actions, like awarding high school diplomas and college degrees to students who had almost finished those degrees, but their education was interrupted by the internment. I also want to mention there are other people interned, 25,000 Japanese Canadians, 2,000 Japanese Peruvians sent to the US, about 10,000 German Americans, and 3,000 Italian Americans. So please come to Japantown if you haven't been here. We have a number of shops and restaurants. We have festivals. Unfortunately, our biggest one, the Obon, hasn't been held for a couple of years because of the pandemic, but eventually that will end. So I like to think of San Jose's Japantown as a thriving residential and small business community that has a multicultural past, present, and a vibrant future to come. And you can learn more about us at this website right here. Thank you all very much for your attention tonight. I've enjoyed giving this presentation to you. And we are open now, Thursday through Sunday, noon to 4. There is a modest admission fee, but if you haven't been to our museum or haven't been there recently, please come by.
All right, thank you so much, Gordon. And now I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.